This is Tracy Hales Vass with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico. Today I'm talking with Gary and Elaine Montague, co-authors of Victory from the Shadows, Growing Up in a New Mexico School for the Blind and Beyond. Hello, Elaine and Gary.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you guys today?
We're doing just fine. Now that we have summer in progress.
Good. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your memoir with me about those days growing up in the New Mexico School for the Blind and Beyond. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, we appreciate your time, too.
Thank you. Well, now, this book is told in first person as if Gary were telling it. But Elaine, what was your part in writing this? How did you guys write it together?
She was the writer.
Okay.
I gave her the juice and she put it in the bucket.
I get it. Okay.
But he did approve of every word.
Yes, I did.
I'm sure there was a lot of reading back and forth and saying, no, I need to change that.
9 years worth.
Well, it's
and a lot of research, too.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of facts and statistics in the book. I was really fascinated that in that day and age, people with a visual impairment were sent away to a boarding school.
Yes, that frequently happens pretty much all over the country. Because most of our boarding schools rather than public schools, you didn't send visually impaired kids to regular schools.
So that was very traumatic in itself, just being sent away from the farm. But also it turned out to be a pretty good education.
It was wonderful. The education was great. When I got to college, where I found that a lot of the people that I went to college with hadn't had as nearly as good an education as I had.
Isn't that interesting? And you managed to succeed well at UNM.
Yes, I did at UNM, and I had about 300 readers who read for me. So that made it nice. I had a lot of pretty company.
There you go.
You were all volunteers, too.
300.
Volunteer, and a sorority, and the town club sorority, and then some of the fellows from one of the fraternities did some reading for me. Yes, I just had in those days have a good memory.
Well, you know what's interesting is that this was before the Americans with Disability Act gave more support.
Well, and Gary didn't even have a tape recorder the first semester he went to UNM.
Oh, my gosh.
No, not in fact for the first year or two, actually.
So he was going from a specialized school where he probably wasn't all that aware that he had all these, accommodations. And then he went to UNM that had nothing. It didn't have a buddy system. It didn't have a mentor system. It didn't have, he didn't even know there was a catalog when he first got there.
Right.
He was enrolled but not registered.
That's amazing. Right.
When he first got there.
So it was a matter of you doing your own legwork, and then after you came into the picture, Elaine, the two of you figuring out how to meet those needs.
Right, but I didn't meet him until he was already a junior.
Right.
So he pretty much had that in place.
That's great.
Where I met him.
I think that's really interesting that the sorority girls volunteered for that, to read. And
well, it's kind of interesting, too. I think that in high school, I had heard about Town Club. It was a sorority an independent sorority, non-Panhellenic, and it was for women who lived in Albuquerque. And in those days, a lot of the girls lived at home and went to college in their town. And so that's what it was for. And I had chosen that that's the group I wanted to belong to. I don't remember how I heard about them. And when I got there, they were the ones who were reading to Gary. And it was one of the girls in the sorority who actually introduced us.
Well, the way that worked actually was the lady who really headed up and spearheaded the group who read to me was the secretary to the Dean of Men. And she took a particular interest in me and the needs I had there, and so she got the gals involved, and so it made a wonderful relationship. I met a lot of wonderful people and very outstanding people, and one of the ladies that was the first reader I had turned out to be one of the translators worked at Sandia Laboratories for the library out there.
Oh.
She was also one of our beta readers. We're still friends with several of those women.
So was that through that connection how you ended up working at Sandia Labs?
No.
So as a matter of fact, I came to working at Sandia Labs through a friend of my mother's who was involved in state politics in some remote fashion, and she recommended that I might contact the people, certain people that were at Sandia Labs, and so there's where I got my interview opportunity, and I went from there.
And you were there for quite a while.
Oh yes, I was there for 5 years.
Amazing.
How many? 32, I think.
Yep.
Well, me and Sandia, yes. I was thinking of university.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing is, and then even when you were at Sandia Labs, such an innovative company, there were still needs that weren't met for you.
Oh, yes. Yes, and then I found that I didn't get, for example, comparable pay to other people and working doing the same jobs I had, and I wasn't given an opportunity to become a staff member, even though some of the fellows that I came to Sandia with at that time got to go to staff members right away. So there were some problems.
And
That's still true today. Only about 70% of the blind and visually impaired people, according to the National Federation of the Blind, are unemployed full-time today in the United States. And less than 15% of them have a college education today. Right. There's still a lot of problems with their education and with, because many of the kids, unfortunately, I don't have the statistic on how many drop out and don't graduate from high school, but there are some.
I'm sure.
Right there.
Well, it was interesting that New Mexico has a higher rate of blind and visually impaired.
The problem is that a lot of the blind in my day were blind in this state because of a sad situation in which many had syphilis.
Right.
Which is a sad thing, but it's a true thing.
Right.
One of the things I found in researching was just a few cities had great sanitation plants, and we're talking about way back,
right,
in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so Gary said he wasn't really aware of anyone who had a problem because of syphilis, but according to the statistics, that does seem to be one of the problems. And so it was the health care that was, and I guess because we're such a rural state,
right,
and a small population, even now in 2015 to 16, according to the census, there are 65,200 blind and visually impaired people in New Mexico. But there's a problem with statistics, and that is the definition of blindness.
Okay.
And there's no agreement across the country or the world exactly how to define all these things. So you have numbers that tell about how far people can see and acuity and so forth. But blindness is a range, and it goes all the way from no perception of light to all the way
20/20 vision.
Yeah, well, that would be blindness, but the problem is like with low vision, it can't be corrected or improved with regular eyeglasses or surgeries or anything like that. Gary has low vision and has had since birth. And of that, we've got a statistic for that, too. 245 246 million people in the world are classified as having low vision.
Oh my gosh. And
Yeah, there are a lot of us out there.
that's really true. I'm surprised that even with the bringing forth of the ADA, there's not more improvements as to...
The population's probably growing too.
Right.
The population's
Right.
growing, and
Worldwide. I mean,
and a lot of the problems too is that a lot of the benefits that are available for visually impaired and blind people are not widely advertised. You know, the names of the groups might be spoken about, but really, for people to know what's going on, like even at the school, I remember my instructors and so forth, what went on amongst the staff in the school was very, very quiet, very secretive.
Interesting.
And they had to go and lobby to the legislature every year for the funds we had and how those would be spent. So that was very, very closely guarded.
And
Helen Keller actually came to the state and
right.
addressed the legislature and helped get money. And also, the school was named an asylum way back in the early
Right.
1900s.
An asylum, and that really
so
gave...
They've gone from asylum to school. The name's changed several times. They've gone from handicapped to impaired as the public perception changed.
And hopefully as attitudes change.
Well, and some people call it misconceptions, and they say that those of us who have sight have a lot of misconceptions about blind and visually impaired people and whether or not they're capable. I mean, there's studies that show some people don't even believe they can cook a meal or whatever, and it's pretty incredible. We've known totally blind people who go up on the roof and change their air conditioner
yes.
out, their swamp coolers out and things like that, install ceiling fans in their houses.
And there's a passage...
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more hidden talent. I think that's part of the reason we wanted the book to come out as it did, is because it's to prove to people that actually you can accomplish, regardless of your limitations. There are things you can do which you want to do, which makes allows you to make a stand in your community or in your country.
Right.
Just because you're blind doesn't make you an idiot.
That's right. And it was interesting that some people would look away from you and talk really slowly, thinking that...
Or yell at you.
Right.
That I get frequently. People will yell at me thinking that because I'm blind, I'm deaf.
I can't hear either. Yes. Yes, great misperceptions. One thing I noticed also in the book is how the settings were described in more than visually, with the smells and the textures and the feel of things. Yeah. And I thought, yes, those senses were enhanced for you.
Yes.
And you described that well.
Well, you learn to depend on them, perhaps.
Right.
Much more, yes, you do. Because when that car's coming down the street, you want to make sure you don't want to cross when he's there.
Right. So you learn through hearing how to judge that. I liked the adventures of you trying to drive your dad's truck.
Well, I tried until he got in the way with his tractor and I ran into him.
Right. And then the windows were muddy, so that was his fault too.
That's right.
Very good. Well,
I
think
like walking around with blindfolds.
Right. Well, your parents, Gary, were very supportive in trying to do the best for their kids. You described them really well. I feel like I got to know the parents very well too.
Yes, they were supportive of what I was doing. Mother more than Dad.
Yes.
She was determined that I was not going to be unable to keep up with my fellow students, or that I'm not going to be able to do something worthwhile. She knew that I wanted more than that, and that I wouldn't be able to, for example, drive a tractor, perhaps, but I would be able to shovel the grain.
That's right. That's right. And that you were an intelligent young man who would be successful with a good education.
Appreciate that. Yes, that's what they thought. I've kept them food all these years.
There you go. So you two have...
One of the most exciting things that happened during this writing process was when we found the letters. We didn't know there were letters, and 60 years after they were written, Gary's niece called him and said, "There's some papers here in my mother's things." This was after his sister died. And she said, "I think that these need to go to you."
Oh.
And so we went to pick them up, and there were letters you see, he was required to dictate because he was required when he got to the school for the blind. They said, "You have to learn Braille." And so they wouldn't let him read print anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he could read print, but he couldn't read it well. And so he was required to dictate letters. Now, this is at 8 years old. He was dictating these letters. And so there were letters from the teacher that the teacher wrote to Gary's parents and the letters that Gary wrote to his parents.
Right.
And it was just amazing because
yes.
it was, we didn't even know, we were well into the writing process by then. It was wonderful.
Oh, yes. Those really add a lot to that.
Yes, those letters are very good to find and
Absolutely.
And a lot to tickle my memory because a lot of that stuff I'd forgotten about.
Right.
You know?
But then you had it in print, so there it was. That's great.
Yes,
Elaine, do you want to read something from the book for us?
All right.
And this is like I said, the book is written in the first person in Gary's point of view. So what you're reading will be in the voice of a young boy, right?
I certainly hope so. I just might not sound like one.
That's okay. That's okay.
Okay, we're going to start with Home for Christmas.
Okay, good.
Because
like that.
Gary went home only in the summers and at Christmas time for 11 years. The ride home was terrific. This time there was no freight, so the engineer let me wear his cap while we walked all the way to the caboose and forward to the engineer's cab. He showed me the throttle, the air brake controls, the SAM controls, and several gauges and indicators that told the engineer and his assistant, the fireman, how well the locomotive was performing. The brakeman and conductor visited with me, too. I arrived at the Tucumcari depot in a very good mood. Dad stood by the pickup with a broad grin on his welcoming face. At our house, I peeked inside every little canister and jar with a lid. Some had narrow red ribbons around their necks and small sprigs of green. All kinds of mouth-watering smells hinted of tastiness. Joanne told me that for weeks, Mom held back on the rationed sugar to have enough to send me goodies and make holiday cookies, date loaf, Brazil nut fruitcake, English toffee, and those little coconut candies dipped in chocolate. Rationing was the way it was during World War II. Everything was decorated and delicious. "You did a good job, sis. Want to play some games?" "I've got a new comic book I can read to you," she replied. Since I had trouble making sense of the pictures, I seldom looked at any kind of funnies, but she made it interesting before we played the games. Outside, my dogs jumped on me and wagged their whole back ends with joy each time they smelled my scent and heard my voice. They sniffed me all over, and I laughed when I pushed them away. They came back for more. We played hard out near the fields and the barn and corrals. I ran my hands down their backs and scratched behind their ears. We checked out the hens and cattle, the pigs and horses. "Hey, Dad, you got the place looking good. Boy, I saved some repairs for you to help me with." His tools felt good in my hands. I squeezed the handles and rolled them in my palms, balancing and regripping. I had dreamed of them and how I'd make sure they got back where they belonged. We braced up a couple of shelves in the barn and resoled one of my shoes. I found Dad's awl and told him about Lewis and the stylus. A few days before Christmas, I saw the postmistress, Mrs. Holly, when I went for the morning mail. She acted like she'd missed me. "I hear it's real nice down there in Alamogordo. Your mother thought the buildings and flowers looked good when she was there. People were friendly to her, too. She thought the Christmas decorations must look real pretty with colored lights and red balls on the trees. She wished she could see them and hear your public performance." I asked her to come. I wanted her to come. The teacher, my forehead wrinkled and my head jerked. Had I heard Mrs. Holly say something about my teacher? A big family came into the store, and I missed some of her words. By the time I could ask Mom, she said something about having lots of work to do and not a thing about my teacher, so I forgot.
That was a very interesting thing to find out about the teacher later.
Yes, this is the head-banging teacher.
Yes.
It was my head that was getting banged, though.
Right.
On a concrete wall.
I know. That was terrible.
Luckily, that was not the norm.
Right.
No.
And she didn't.
And luckily, she didn't stay there long.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
And a lighter moment was when he had violin class.
Uh-huh.
Some of the best fun was in violin class with Miss Clark. It was a lot of work, but I liked the other three boys in the violin orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
Macario, David, and Lucio performed as a trio last week. They were a couple of years older than I. Miss Clark said I was good enough to make it a quartet. We each had our own practice times outside of class. She told us, boys, I am watching your strokes very carefully. Don't be nervous. I will make sure your bows rise and fall at the same time so that your music is good. Like them, I held my bow as Miss Clark adjusted each of them. The hair had to be just so, and so did our fingers. Put your fingers like this. Try to sense what your fingers feel. I held the fiddle under my chin. She put her hand on mine to show how to hold the bow and how tightly it had to be drawn to make it sound right. Place your little finger between the bow back and the bow hair and tighten the knurled knob at the back end of the bow, Miss Clark said. The thickness of your little finger is the proper distance between the hair and the back. I didn't want anything but the bow hair to strike the strings because it would not sound right and it might damage the bow or the violin. Loose bow hair sounded scratchy. I adjusted the tension. Listen for the tone. I heard Miss Clark's tuner or a note on the piano. She taught me to tune the catgut strings of my instrument. I loved it. We had a...
Do you play violin?
No, I play piano.
Oh, hey, great.
Right. I think the violin's really hard to play.
It is hard to play, yes.
So you actually got a very well-rounded education.
Yes, I did. I was very fortunate.
I've picked out a few more samples if you want them.
Please.
Okay. Well, Gary said, well, I'd like something about us and our dating and so forth and our marriage maybe. So,
okay.
Our dates, Elaine and I walked or rode the bus to campus activities and dances. We ordered thin-crusted pepperoni pizza at Casa Luna. Sometimes we double-dated, but we did not need other people or lots of hubbub because we enjoyed being together by ourselves. Do you like what I'm wearing? She asked one day. You could wear a burlap sack and I would like it. Next day, we were in the dorm recreation room alone. She removed her coat to reveal she was dressed in a burlap bag. I picked her up and spun her around as we laughed.
That was very funny.
I can't even remember where in the world I got that burlap bag.
I don't either.
And then some of the things that came up were interactions with my father. My father was an Air Force colonel.
Uh-huh.
And he was a commanding presence, only about 5'5".
Nuclear physicist.
A nuclear physicist, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Gary would come out to the base, and I would read to him, and we would play games or whatever like that, and so forth. But so here he's talking about catching the last bus out of the base. Not too long thereafter, on a winter night, I left Elaine's home and searched for the gate of the military base. I had trouble because it was snowing. I'm going to freeze before I get there, I thought, wishing her father had offered me a ride. He never did that. Was he trying to show her how adequate or inadequate I was and whether I could take care of her? I knew I could, but I felt I needed to prove it to him. I guess fathers are like that about daughters. On a more pleasant night a couple of months later, I walked confidently across the grassy area. Without warning, I fell into a newly dug trench in an unlit field that I had crossed many times before. I held on to the edge while my feet dangled. I dug my fingers into the dirt as I tried to climb from the trench. Disoriented and hurting all over, I struggled out and heard a motor. If the soldier had not given me a ride to the base gate, I would never have caught the last bus out for the night. Just one of the hazards about being visually impaired.
Right.
And then another interaction with my dad.
Uh-huh.
About halfway through practicum, he was doing student teaching for his degree in secondary education.
Mm-hmm.
About halfway through practicum, we decided I would make a formal request for her hand. She had worn my engagement ring for several months. Elaine left me with her father all afternoon while she and her mom visited her mother's millinery instructor and examined the latest styles of hats. I sat talking to Pop Carson, sweating it out alone. The day faded into evening. He put on no lights. He told me, "She's very young, you know." Smugly, I responded, I planned to raise her to suit myself. I was confident I could. There were silences with little small talk. Puff, puff on our pipes. The smell of peach brandy and cherry blend tobacco hung in the air. The colonel finally told me, "I know you don't have sight like most do, but you have traits that far surpass those of others she could marry. You can give her things they can't." Mom and Dad came the next month to meet Elaine's parents, and Dad commented that Pop Carson had very kind eyes. I was surprised to hear that because I could not see Pop's eyes, but I knew he was gentle and not haughty as some officers seemed to be. I wondered if my dad had kind eyes. He might have, because he told me a father ought to give his son his first car and asked me if I would like to have his copper and white 57 Chevy Bel Air.
Yes, quite the car, quite the gift.
That car was a good old car.
Even if it didn't have backup lights, right?
You're right. And needed a repair almost as soon as we got it for all the money that we had.
That's great.
Yeah.
Now, what are you guys up to now that you've finished this book?
Well, we're trying to get ourselves ready to go in and market the thing through various meetings and so forth to advertise its presence to various companies or groups that we think might be interested in, because we want the book to help people understand
Right.
that blind people can feel and do what they want to do in a better way than people think they can.
That's exactly what the book does.
Oh, wonderful. I'm glad to hear that,
Yes,
Tracy.
I learned a lot.
I'm hoping it'll be used for undergraduate and graduate students for teacher training.
Right.
I have a friend who thinks every seventh grader in the United States ought to have to read it.
I can see that. I agree.
But it would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Our intent is to help people with children with
Right.
disabilities understand what the child goes through and how to better help them than the way they would otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't understand what was going on.
I think this does that. And people who have friends with
Yeah.
visual impairments.
Well, we've got a couple of sayings. One that's going to appear on the back of the book. It says, "Diverse needs require diverse solutions."
Right.
And the other one is, our theme is persevere with integrity, whatever the challenge. And we talked about that a little bit. Gary ran into that a few times when he had to stand up to a professor who thought he should be able to bubble in the little answers like everybody else could.
Right.
Or on the job, when you have to decide whether you're going to stand up for something that's not the popular thing to say,
Exactly.
or whether you're going to hold and wait for a different time.
Well, do you have a web presence that our listeners can go to?
Yes, we do. I wish I had a really catchy name for it, but somebody told me that an author website ought to have a person's name. And so since I'm the one who works the computer more than Gary does, it's www.elainemontague.com. And that is ELAINEMONTAGUE.com.
And where can they find the book?
So it will be available at Barnes & Noble and in Albuquerque at Bookworks, and I'm hoping at Treasure House, and perhaps at Bibles Plus, Page One, Organic. The reader, your audience needs to go to the bookstore and say, "I'm interested in this book called Victory from the Shadows, going up in a New Mexico school for the blind and beyond, and can you get it for me?"
Well, thank you for making me aware of the book and giving me the opportunity to interview you.
And Gary and I did just recently, about a week ago, celebrate our 59th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
So we feel like that maybe shows that we kind of know something about our topic.
A little bit, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Gary and Elaine Montague, talking about their book, Victory from the Shadows, Growing Up in a New Mexico School for the Blind and Beyond. This is Tracy Hales-Vass, right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico.